Hello, my name is Bruce, and welcome to my 3 observations on the Hunger Games Catching Fire. If you're watching this on YouTube, please go to thehutchfiles.com to get my full breakdown of the narrative structure of the movie. You can also find my other breakdowns, information on films, and subscribe to get future posts sent directly to your inbox. So, let's talk about the Hunger Games Catching Fire. Directed by Gary Ross and, of course, starring the great Jennifer Lawrence. There's 3 observations that I'd like to make about this movie that I think are a little interesting and unusual. The first one is a comparison between the original Hunger Games and Catching Fire. Both of them have similar structures, but with Catching Fire being 146 minutes long, we have an interesting 5-act structure, which is pretty unusual in most movies until we start getting into the 2.5-hour to 3-hour length. The setup is pretty similar. In the original Hunger Games, Act 1 is the setup of the world. Act 2 is the preparation as Katniss and Peeta get ready for the games, and then Acts 3 and 4 are the games themselves. Catching Fire is a little interesting because Acts 1 and 2 both serve as setup, which is, I think, a little more interesting than we might expect. The first goal of Act 1 is for Katniss to convince President Snow that she and Peeta are in a committed relationship. We see at the end of the climax when they go to the big party at the mansion that Snow is not convinced. He shakes his head at Katniss, and Katniss has failed at her goal. What really becomes interesting in this setup is Act 2, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But the Act 2 goal is really to try to deal with the capital occupation of District 12, and of course we have the climax of Katniss and Peeta being chosen for the Quarter Quell. So rather than having the 1-act setup of the Hunger Games, we actually have both Acts 1 and 2 functioning as setups for Catching Fire. And then the rest of the structure is pretty similar. Act 3 is preparation for the games, just like Act 2 had been preparation in the Hunger Games. And then Acts 4 and 5 of Catching Fire are basically the games themselves, just like we saw Acts 3 and 4 of the original Hunger Games function as where we see the games play out. The second observation I'd like to make is about this second act. We usually do not have 2 setup acts. We usually only have 1. Now, we could try to claim that this is one long setup act, but it would be running at 52 minutes, which would be a really long first act. We also, I think, have a pretty strong climax around the 31-minute mark when Snow indeed does let Katniss know that their attempts at faking a romance have failed. So what we end up with is a pretty short Act 2 that ramps up the conflict with the Capitol and tries to get us pretty quickly to why we're here, which is the games. But of course, the games are going to be a little different than they had been before. So we have Act 1 ending around the 33.5-minute mark, where Plutarch Heavensbee hatches the plan to make people hate Katniss. And then, of course, in Act 2, we have Snow's forces coming into District 12, and we've got Katniss, we've got Peeta, we've got Gale, all trying to deal with the fact that these people are there and everything that's going on. And, of course, we've got the famous scene where Gale stops one of the soldiers of Snow's army from attacking someone, and he ends up getting strapped to the whipping post, and then both Katniss, Peeta eventually come out to try to stop that. And so, of course, we then get the climax, which happens right around the 51-minute mark, where we have, of course, Katniss and Peeta's names chosen for the Quarter Quell. And of course, they're going to have to go back and compete in the games again. This second act starts around the 33.5-minute mark and runs to 52 minutes. So it's not even 20 minutes. It's a very short act. It's about as short as an act as you'll generally see in a movie. But it is an important act, I think, because we don't have our normal setup. We actually have a pretty complex setup, which is interesting because this is a sequel and we ought to be able to set things up pretty quickly. But of course, the filmmakers and of course the original novel don't want to just have a repeat of the same games. And so we have to do this extra setup in order to set up the quarter quell and to set up the fact that Katniss and Peeta are going to have to compete again in the Hunger Games. The third observation I'd like to make is about the fourth and fifth acts and the way the protagonist works in those acts. In a lot of movies like The Avengers, we have what's called a mass protagonist, where we have an entire group of characters who all share a same act goal or movie level goal. And when we get into the games, sort of in this island bowl kind of situation, we've got Katniss and we've got Peeta, and then of course we've got some of the other previous winners of the games who form a team that are all supposed to be working towards the same goal of survival. And so they do seem like they're acting as a mass protagonist. But what's interesting about this is that really within this structure, we have a lot of complication. First of all, Katniss does not want to partner with all of the other previous victors. She wants to save Peeta. That is her goal, is to save Peeta. But everyone else, including Peeta, have the goal of saving Katniss so that she can become the Mockingjay, the face of the revolution. And of course, that's going to launch us into the third of the Hunger Games movies. So it's interesting that on the surface, I think Katniss partly thinks that they sort of have a general goal of partnering and surviving for a while, but all along she has her own goal, which is to save Peeta, and she's really working against the goal that all of the other characters around her have. So what we end up with is sort of a misleading mass protagonist situation, where on one level it seems like everyone is kind of working towards the same thing, which is to survive somehow, even though there's only supposed to be one winner. And yet at the same time, we've got Katniss, who is doing one thing, and then unbeknownst to her, we've got this whole group of victors who are all trying to work towards a different goal, which is to save Katniss, something that she does not want to happen because she wants to save Peeta. So those are our three observations about the Hunger Games Catching Fire. Hope you found them interesting and insightful into how this movie is working.